Good evening all and welcome. Tonight I have a chilling collection of scary stories from the deep woods. I'm also joined by my good friend Deadly Cure. If you'd like to sample more of his work, you can find a link at the end of the video and in the description. But for now it's time to get comfortable and let the darkness take control. I grew up in Southern California. One thing about that part of the state you'll often hear that you can go surfing and skiing on the same day. With traffic, that's a little tough to believe, but assuming the traffic was light, you could pull it off. I grew up in the Inland Empire, which is about 60 to 90 miles east of LA. We lived near the foothills of the San Bernardino Mountains. My father is a mountain man. I can't overstate enough that he is truly in his element when he is lost in the mountains. He has spent his entire life exploring the local mountains, and he knows every back road, service road trail, and has even a specialized bump key that can be used to unlock forest service roadblocks. I'm going to tell you two stories involving my dad and I in the mountains when some weird stuff went down. This first story is when I was in Boy Scouts. Because my dad was one of them, he wanted me to have those wilderness experiences and become as capable as he is out there. I'm grateful for this, as I had a great time in the Scouts, and even though I'm a city boy, I'm confident that I can go toe-to-toe with my dad in a wilderness survival contest. We were up in the San Bernardino Mountains on a camp out one time, and our camp was pretty deep in the woods. We hiked from 6 a.m. till sunset to get to our campsite. Granted, this is a group of scouts of varying ages and ability in the mountains, so take that into account. My dad and I set up our tent pretty far from the rest of the group, at least 50 meters from the central campfire. We always did this because the younger boys would be up all night making noise, and we liked to sleep after a day of mountaineering. We had just gotten into our mummy bags and finally got comfy when we started to hear rock clicking on the ridge above us, about another 50 to 100 meters up the valley. My dad is a big-time Sasquatch believer, and I certainly believe there are things in the wilderness that humans can't comprehend, and there is plenty of wilderness in the US for anything to hide in for as long as it wants. My dad gets on the radio and other scout leaders and asked them to do a head count for the boys and if any of the adults had gone off into the woods. Everyone was accounted for. This wasn't a particularly popular trail, so it was unlikely anyone else was in the area beside us. So we got quiet and just listened. We noticed there weren't any insect noises in the area. We were just lying in our tent listening intently. I was trying to listen over the sound of my heart beating out of my chest. It was so quiet that I could hear the blood pulsing in my brain. More rock clicking, and these weren't little rocks, they sounded like significantly large rocks, too heavy for a human of average strength to hold in each hand and bang together. My heart was racing at this point. I'm not so much scared as I am excited. My dad and I spent a lot of time in the mountains when I was a kid, so I was quite familiar with all kinds of animal noises and things that went bump in the night. And I believed my dad when he told me that Sasquatch wasn't a violent creature, but it was territorial and would let you know when you crossed a boundary. Rock clicking and throwing is one of those signals. We heard rocks being flung off the ridge and crashing down in the valley below, about 30 to 50 meters downhill, though not a sheer drop. So there had been some serious strength to throw those rocks. As far as it sounded, they were being thrown. Then it got quiet. It was quiet for long enough that we figured old Biggie was done and had gone off to bed. All of a sudden, we hear a whole ass tree being ripped out the ground. Keep in mind, this is about 75 meters and probably 30 meters above our elevation. This valley had a solid echo to it, but I kid you not, I could hear the roots of this tree being ripped from the ground. Now I was getting scared. It's one thing to throw rocks at intruders like us. It's another thing to rip a damn tree out the ground. But that was it. After that, all quiet. None of the rest of the group heard anything that night. The next day we hiked up the ridge and checked the area out. We found large rocks that had been cracked open, and we found a spot where we think a tree might have been pulled out, but no tree anywhere nearby. We found some thick hair caught in the bark of a few trees, and it smelled like garbage sitting in a hot metal trash can in the summer. The ground was too firm for any definitive footprints to be found, but there were a lot of branches on the ground, broken off surrounding trees to be about 8 feet. My dad and I, and a few other of the leaders, decided we had disturbed the peace enough and packed up the camp and moved on. There were no further incidences during this trip, and we never told the other scouts. The second story happened on the other side of San Bernardino Peak, or Mount San Bernardino depending who you ask. My dad and I were hiking up to the summit, where he had spread his father's ashes back in 1987, and just a few months after I was born. We had tried multiple times to get to the summit, but my dad was in his 40s at the time and had high blood pressure, which always made him too weak to be around 2,600 meters above sea level. Anyway, he was on a new medication now and was determined to summit the peak and have a spiritual moment with me where his dad was laid to rest. My grandfather was a serious, badass World War II veteran who was a B-17 Flying Fortress mechanic in England, but he would regularly fly missions as a gunner when they were short on men, and would also fly in gliders by night into France to repair salvageable bombers that had been downed during bombing runs. So needless to say, his legacy was important to us, and we were going to get to the top of that damn mountain this time. It was a particularly hot day, and when you're above the clouds and smog, the air is cooler, but the sun more oppressive. It can lull inexperienced hikers into a sense of safety. We weren't well prepared for this hike, as we had underestimated the exposure factor that day. We had only brought 2 Nalgene bottles of water because we wanted to be as light as possible. Well, around 3/4 of the way up the mountain, we ran out of water. It was kind of a decision point. Either we would bust our asses up the mountain and get down quick and call it quits once again, but my dad suddenly remembered a mountain spring not far from us and suggested we hustle down there and fill our bottles. We had water-purifying tablets, so we weren't worried about Giardia, a parasite often found in spring water that causes unpleasant plumbing problems. So we jaunt down to the spring only to find that it was dried up. Now we were in a real pickle. We had to trek back up at least 1,000 feet to get back to the trail, and we were seriously parched at this point. So with no other alternative, we hike back up to the trail. At this point, I'm literally sucking the sweat off my shirt to my wet tongue. We don't see any other cars in the trailhead parking lot and had run into no other hikers. As far as we knew, we were totally alone on the mountain that day. So we're standing there panting and trying to figure out what to do, when along comes a man down the trail from the direction of the summit. It almost looked like he was floating. He was just so gently trotting down the trail towards us. He was older, had grey hair and a short grey beard, hiking poles and a blue bandana wrapped around his head. He stopped in front of us and said, "Lovely day, isn't it, fellas?" It was around 10 a.m, and we had been hiking for 4 hours already. So it was odd that this guy was already on his way down. My dad asks, "Did you sleep up there last night, or are you the fastest hiker alive?" with a small chuckle. My dad always had a way of keeping his cool in a bad situation, and he wanted to be friendly with the guy so that he may give us some water. "Oh no, I've just seen what I came here to see, and I'll be off shortly," he said. I remember that exact quote, because it seemed so odd for him to say. He continued, "You boys look pretty thirsty. You run out of water? The mountain can be quite deceiving on a hot day like this, no?" My dad replied, Funny you should mention that. We did in fact run out of water. Before my dad could continue, the man interjected, "And you went down there to that yonder spring and found it dry, no?" We both nodded our heads, totally dumbfounded. This spring was so well hidden, my dad said before we went to it, probably no one alive today besides he knew about it. The man continued, "Well, I have about a gallon of water here in my pack. Probably not enough for you two to summit today, but enough to get you hydrated and down the mountain." He produced a gallon jug of water and said, "Drink it in good health. And come prepared next time, yeah? I won't always be around to save your asses." We took the water and thanked him profusely. With a grin on his face, he continued trotting down the trail like it was nothing. This was a pretty difficult trail and had lots of rocks and uneven parts, but I distinctly remember this old man breezing through it, like he was just floating. We drank a good few sips, filled our Nalgene and headed back. Around the bend, there was a long series of switchbacks, and this was above the tree line, so there wasn't really anything to obstruct your view the whole way down this section of the trail. But when we rounded the bend and looked down, the man was gone. There was no way he could have descended those switchbacks that fast, even if he was floating along the path. My dad and I looked at each other, and without a word, we started down the trail back to the car. To this day, we are convinced that man was an angel sent to save our asses. We eventually made it to the summit on another trip, well prepared this time, and had a ceremony honoring the memory of my grandfather. And we also gave thanks to the angel that had seen what he came to see that day. Two thirsty men who needed a drink and a lesson. This story is one told to me by my Uncle Rick. Out of every story I've ever heard any other individual tell, or any of the little scary experiences I've had in my life, this story is by far the scariest one of all. It was told to me in 2019, right before the corona outbreak. But this happened to my uncle when he was 26, sometime in the mid-80s. He had a big traumatizing experience in life, knowing that he had served in the service, but this being on top of just scary things. During the late 80s, Uncle Rick had just had a son with his longtime wife that he is still married to today, Aunt Bart. Uncle Rick has always lived near the woods, and they had this one cabin way in the woods that they would let visitors or family friends rent out on vacation. My uncle always kept the cabin and area around it neat, and would always have him and his friends cut the grass, bushes, and even the trees around it if need be. It was one summer day, sometime in the beginning of summer, around the middle of May, I believe. He said that he and his close friends that he had met in the service had come back from a hike that they would always take once a week, where they would walk and talk, mostly about their old-time experiences, future plans, and sometimes other subjects that would be considered deep. My uncle told me that the way they would walk would be like a distance going past the cabin. While going past on this particular day, my uncle remembered glancing over to the cabin and getting a view of the grass, and commenting that it had been at least 2 weeks since the last time he mowed it. My uncle just had a habit of keeping out in the yard of his house and the cabin orderly in case of visitors, and just always being taught by my grandparents on how to keep things tidy. So after saying this to himself, his friend Ed glanced and chuckled. "Damn, Rick, you're known for being that freak of keeping things in order." "You're right," Uncle Rick replied. "I'm ready to get it cut if I have time today." Uncle Rick said that Ed had volunteered to help him when they got back, which was around 8. One cut the front, while the other cut the back. Around 9 is when they had begun to finish in the yard, and by the time the sun was beginning to set, Uncle Rick began to pack up, and so did Ed. Once Uncle had got the mower that he had specifically for the cabin grass, he began to walk out to the backyard where Ed was. This cabin was fenced off, and the fence gate door wrapped around the side of the house. So after putting the mower in the garage, Uncle Rick had let down the garage and began to head towards Ed, so they could head back to the house where they would put away that mower that was really used specifically for the house. Now, from my Uncle Rick's mouth, as he was walking to the fenced gate door, he was about 15 feet away walking with his head down, when he began to smell something he described today as metallic, and just something he doesn't think he'll ever smell again on Earth. But he said what made him look up is the sound. He described it as a very hard whooping-like sound that would get louder and then fade away, and louder and fade away. Once hearing this, he looked up, and as he told me this, I kid you not, he saw a straight white-like line, that he had widened every whooping sound, and that what opened up was full of light he had never seen before. This light was so bright that it took away part of his eyesight, and after seeing this, Uncle Rick said that it was very hard to make out, but at first he saw a rabbit-like figure step out of the line standing on hind legs, like a human but around 7 feet tall. After seeing this, Uncle Rick told me it was like a quick blackout, and then he remembered waking up in a hospital bed. He said that when he first woke up, he had the worst stinging pain that he could ever have in both of his eyes for about 5 minutes. The doctor heard him yelling and came in. My uncle didn't go into asking why he was there, because he said that all that was playing in his head was the light and then the bunny figure. But what was kind of freaking him out more was that the sun was still fully out, which he had told the doctors to close because it was making his eyesight worse, and that they were all having a bit of confusion on their faces. After calming my uncle down, the first thing they could ask was what happened. It took him about 10 minutes to get an answer out, and all he could say was the lawnmower blew up. It didn't explain why there weren't any scars on him, but the doctors saw that they couldn't get an accurate answer out of him, even with my auntie and grandparents and the rest of the family considered who had asked. All he said was the mower had blown up. They asked Ed what happened since he was with my Uncle Rick, but I'll explain that bit in the story later. This experience scared my uncle at that moment, but what made it worse is that when he asked why they looked so confused, one of the nurses told him that he had been asleep for 3 days. To my uncle, it felt like he was knocked out for 10 seconds and then woke back up. This experience really messed him up physically and most definitely mentally. But now it's time for Ed's side of the story. So knowing they could hardly get an answer from Uncle Rick, the family had speculated that Ed had done something to him, but both declined. When Ed was asked, all he could give was a one-word answer that didn't really relate to what happened, that he was scared also. From Ed's perspective, when Ed went to see Uncle Rick after he was first awake, all they would do was talk about the result of how unbelievable it was that they had seen something never explained to them or seen in any movies. But when Uncle Rick gathered the courage to ask Ed what he had seen, Ed said this: "I finished mowing the grass. Not too long, like 2 minutes after you. After I sat down, I was down for a few minutes and heard you put away the lawnmower. A few minutes later, I swear I heard footsteps, which Uncle Rick confirmed to be as he was beginning to walk back to Ed." After hearing that, Ed begins to describe the exact same thing Uncle Rick did. A very hard whooping sound that kept fading in and out. Ed said the sound was so unexplainable he thought it was just his eardrums, but when he walked around the house, as soon as he got around there he saw a light, and the line get smaller and smaller. After that he saw Uncle Rick unconscious, not move a muscle. He tried shaking him but got no reply. He checked for a pulse to assure Uncle Rick was still alive, and sure enough he could feel one. Ed said that he ran to use the house phone and dialed to get the paramedics over. He said he was waiting for their arrival and didn't really want to step back outside, having a whole lot running through his head. There was major confusion on what he just saw, and he said that he didn't really get enough to fully think about it in the moment until days after. A few days later, he got the other side of the story and was more scared. After listening to both sides, they told each other to not say a word and just continue to cover up the stories. But down the line, Uncle Rick would begin to open up about his story, and just a certain few being his kids, who were over a certain age, and me. He said that this is a lesson to always know, and they will let you know as much about this world and try and keep things under covers, but some of these things will show themselves. This right here has scarred my uncle, but opened his beliefs to way more things. He stopped being a religious man and started to study more about this world and himself. Now my uncle at age 60 spends his life in nature and traveling the world, looking for lots of other things about life.
My husband has always loved the woods and nature just as much as me, so when I found out that he had never been camping, I just knew I'd have to take him. Keep in mind, I've only been camping at the beach my whole life, never in the forest. About 2 years ago, my husband and I and our 3-year-old daughter moved to Arizona. We moved to Phoenix, and being only about 2 hours away from Flagstaff, I decided to take him camping. We ended up in Williams, a smaller town 30 minutes away from Flagstaff. We loved it there. The forest was beautiful, and it was so quiet away from the city. It was amazing. We didn't find a spot to camp until about 9 o'clock at night. The spot we chose was pretty nice. It was right by Coleman Lake, which isn't a lake at all. It's a big patch of grass. It's a little open field surrounded by trees. There's also a little dirt road that goes through it. And the best part was we were a good ways away from any other campers. We set our tents up in the dark. Our only light was coming from our car. When we were all done, we started a fire. Our daughter was tired, so we put her in the tent right behind us to go to bed. About 2 hours had passed, and we decided to turn in for the night. At 3:28 a.m., I woke up. I don't know exactly what woke me up, but I had a really weird feeling. I laid there looking up at the top of the tent for what felt like forever. That's when I heard it. From somewhere in the woods behind me, something was walking towards our tent. I told myself it was probably just a deer or an elk, since we could hear elk practically screaming most of the night, so I knew they were close by. But whatever it was stopped right behind our tent, and didn't move for what felt like hours. I was so scared I couldn't move. I couldn't wake up my husband, who had his gun with him, to tell him something was outside. I don't know how long I lay there waiting for it to move, to walk away or do something. But soon the sun came up, and that was the end of it. I pulled myself together and went outside to check, but nothing was there, and I swear it never left. I told my husband and he brushed it off. You probably fell asleep at some point and the deer just walked off. As much as I believed otherwise, I brushed it off. The next night went just the same as the first. Something walked up to the tent, stood there, and disappeared. It would be 2 months before we went camping again. Knowing that area the best, we decided to stay in the same campsite as before. This time my parents came with us. When night came, my husband and I were left sitting by the fire as everyone went to bed. I began recalling the last time we stayed here, and my husband pointed out that there were a lot of elk in the area, and that's probably all it was. As we talked, we could hear elk screaming in the distance all around us. At 3:29 a.m., I woke up to something walking towards our tent. I was prepared to wake up my husband this time, not wanting to look crazy. When this thing stopped once again behind our tent, I turned over to wake him up, when something else happened that made me freeze. It started walking around the tent. It walked around the right side of the tent, the side I was laying on, stopped, picked something up and began dragging whatever it was all the way to the front of the tent. It almost sounded like it was dragging a large stick. The second it got to the door of our tent, I somehow was able to wake my husband and tell him someone was standing in front of our tent. Luckily, he has always been a man of action, so the second I said that, he grabbed his gun and opened the tent. All of this took no more than a few seconds, but nothing was there. He got a flashlight and walked around the area, but found nothing. He said if someone or something was out there in front of our tent, like I said, then we would have at least seen it or heard it running away. But I knew what I heard. I wasn't crazy. The rest of the night we stayed up together, but nothing happened. The next morning I asked my parents if they heard anything. My father said no, but my mother said she thought she heard someone walking around outside, but assumed it was us. And with that answer, I knew I wasn't just hearing things. This was real. On the next night, I convinced my husband to stay up with me. We sat in the tent in silence. Around 3 a.m., my husband began to complain he was tired. As I tried to beg him to stay awake, we heard the loudest scream from an elk I have ever heard. Soon, it sounded like a whole herd of them came running past our campsite from behind us. Scared from how close they got, we sat up and just stared at each other for what seemed like forever. Something must have scared them, probably a mountain lion or something, my husband said, still staring at me with wild eyes. Then, from a ways behind our tent, something started walking towards us. I grabbed his arm and told him it's here. He grabbed his gun and jumped out of the tent the second it was behind us, but nothing was there. It took several months before I was willing to go back. I don't know how I was convinced, but I decided to give it a third try. Once again, we went to the same spot, my husband and I, our daughter, and my parents. To spare you the repetitive story, the first night went the same as usual. However, this time my husband heard it all too. Something walking up to the tent and standing there. My husband goes out and scanned the whole area, yet still nothing. Our second night is when it got more interesting and a lot more scary. Sitting by the fire when everyone else was asleep, we talked about the previous night. Everything was always fine when we'd come out of the tent. It was only when we were inside that things started to happen. My husband suggested we sleep outside by the fire this time. That way, if we hear anything, we'd just have to open our eyes to see it. I was unsure about not having the safety of the tent protecting me, but I said okay. We decided to take shifts staying awake. He went first, and once the fire started to die, he would wake me up to help put more wood on. Then we would switch until the fire burned out again. It went on like this for several hours, but the later it got, the harder it was to stay awake. On one of my shifts, I fell asleep. I was slowly woken up by the sound of something passing by, and then it passed by again and again. It passed back and forth several times before realization hit me. I fell asleep. I sat up fast and looked around. It was pitch black, and I couldn't even see anything more than a foot away from me. A feeling of fear came over me that I can't explain. It was like a sense of doom. Something was out there. I just couldn't see it. I woke up my husband and we quickly got the fire going again, and it was my turn to sleep. Eventually, I was woken up to the sound of my husband whispering to me, "Hey, wake up, hey." I woke up, thinking he probably needs me to help with the fire, but when I looked over, he was still sleeping, and the fire was out. I looked around, that same feeling of doom rushing over me. Not bothering to wake him up, I got the fire started again. As soon as the small area around us was full of light, the feeling went away. I stood up and walked to the edge of the firelight and looked out into the darkness. It was like the fire made a wall that separated us from whatever was out there, and it felt like whatever it was It wasn't friendly. The next morning we packed to go home and talked about what happened. Of course, no one believed us, but we knew something was out there. Later, my husband said he had heard something that night too. Something that sounded like me trying to wake him up. Something calling him over. And when he woke up, I was asleep. That was the last time we went camping there, and to be honest, I don't know if I'll ever go camping again. At least, not in those woods.
This happened when I was in the Rockies with my dad one summer vacation when I was 14, and a family of 4 were hiking ahead of us on the trail. We were on our horses, as we trail rode horses for 15 years while I was growing up. The kids petted our horses before they left the trailhead as we were saddling up. We came up on 3 of them just before the bend, stopped and chatted, and asked where the boy of 10 was. They said he was around the bend checking something out. We rode a bit ahead and found the bend, and found a mountain lion in the trail. It was standing above the boy. Blood was everywhere. My dad charged his horse at the mountain lion, pulled the revolver he always carried while we were on the trail, and shot it in the air. Guttiest thing I've ever seen. The lion ran pretty fast into the woods. My dad fired 2 after it after he had passed the boy, then turned around and jumped off to see the kid. I came up since my saddlebag had the first aid kit that we carried. The kid was still alive, but my dad had his hand over the kid's throat and blood was everywhere. Father of the family came around the corner to see what the gunshots were about and saw the boy. There was a lot of yelling, but I really don't remember what was said. I was locked up on my horse. I was a Boy Scout and had first aid training, but I was just frozen there. I don't remember thinking much of anything, I was just in shock. Very sadly, the younger boy didn't make it. The mountain lion was hunted down by park rangers later that day. They found out that it was pregnant and starving, which is why it was likely inclined to target a human. I tell this story here as a warning to hikers, bikers, and whoever goes out into the woods, especially in places with a higher population of predatory animals, like the Rockies. Stay together, stay armed, stay informed of the danger. Listen to the rangers and their warnings, prepare, take precautions, and for God's sake, don't go by yourself. I had just recently gotten through a very rough patch in my life. I had lost my job due to budget cuts, and had found out that my girlfriend of 3 years had been cheating on me. I spent about a month down in the dumps, doing the whole depression thing until I made a big change in my life. You see, I lived in Ohio my entire life, but I have friends all over the US. One of my closest, Sam, lived out in southeastern Montana, outside of the city of Billings, close to the Crow Reservation. I had told him about all of my issues, and he said, word for word, "Well, man, I've got a guest house on the farm that's empty. I need a hand on the farm anyway. If you come out here, the guest house and a job as a farmhand is yours." Before I knew it, I was in Sam's town. I pulled up to Sam's ranch and he greeted me and spent some time playing with my dog, who was more happy to be finally out of the truck. He told me to follow him to the guest house, so I did, and settled in for the night and passed out. Fast forward a week and I had been helping Sam out around on the farm, and one Friday night he says he's got a special treat planned, that we were going to go down to his uncle's cabin in the mountains in the west part of the state, get wrecked, and shoot some elk. He told me to consider it a welcoming party. I was hyped. I hadn't been hunting in a long time, and the opportunity to harvest an elk was something that excited me. Plus, I was a functioning alcoholic at this point and wasn't going to turn down free booze. We pile into my Chevy Blazer. We have 4 rifles, 2 shotguns, and 4 pistols between the 2 of us, and an arseload of ammo. We stop at the gas station and stock up on cigs, chewing tobacco, and of course, Coors Light. We still have to drive 2 more hours to get to the cabin, and hike another hour after that. But Sam is like a brother to me, so we passed the time pleasantly enough talking about politics and stuff. We arrive at the cabin just before sunset, unpack, have a few beers, and went to turn in for the night. The way the cabin was set up was that it had 3 rooms. A big living room with a fireplace, a small bedroom on each side, and a small wood-burning stove in the back. Outside is a shed with a generator inside, and an outhouse. We woke up in the morning and suited up to find an elk to harvest. We followed a big game trail, and time flew, probably because the scenery was completely new to me, and it was so breathtaking. We came to a clearing and I was just following Sam when I heard him mutter out, "What the hell?" I look in his direction and see what he's talking about. We saw a dead bull elk on the ground. It had been gutted and its organs had been pulled out in a methodical fashion, but no meat had been harvested, and the antlers and pelt were all left in place. But that wasn't the strangest part. It was lying in the middle of a strange sigil on the ground. I didn't recognize what it was and assumed it was just some edgy 8th graders or something like that. Sam knelt down and picked something up off the ground and commented that it was probably LARPers or edgy kids. He tells me to calm down so that we can continue hunting. To shorten things, we were unsuccessful, so we turned in and headed back to the cabin to get wasted. I was about 2 Coors Light deep when I watched Sam jet up from the recliner he was sitting in. He walked towards one of the windows with a quickness. "Yo, there's someone outside, grab a few guns." I shot up and began to pray St. Michael's prayer while I walked over to the cabinet with our firearms. When I grabbed them, we slipped our boots on and we could both hear some kind of chanting outside. We shouldered our guns and Sam flipped on the outside light and opened the door. We stuck together, and we could hear chanting clearly but couldn't make out what was being said. But it sounded like it was coming from many directions. I fired a round into the ground and yelled, demanding to know who was out there. Sam yelled that this was private property and that those who didn't clear out would be shot. I could see the vague shape of people moving in the tree line. I couldn't count how many, but it was more than just a few. I heard a loud buzz behind me. Sam had fired off a round from his shotgun, and by this point any buzz from the alcohol was gone. The chanting was becoming audibly louder, and we were getting very spooked. He fired 3 rounds in the general direction of the shapes, not really intending to hit anything, but it didn't do anything to deter them. We inch back to the cabin, this being too freaky for us. He tells me to wait by the door while he packs up essentials, and by essentials he meant our portable floodlights and the rest of our firearms and the MREs we had packed. He locks the cabin door and held his floodlight as we began to walk down the trail towards where my truck was parked. The hike took us an hour on our way up, but it seemed much longer. We could still hear them behind us. We couldn't see or hear anyone following, and we both prayed St. Michael's prayer over and over. We reached the truck and sped out of there. We could see a bright glow coming from the direction of the cabin as we drove off, and we made it back to town, got to the farm, piled in the guest house I was living in, and we didn't sleep all night. 2 weeks later, Sam's uncle called him and asked what happened at the cabin. Sam was confused. His uncle told him that it had been burnt down and the debris had been arranged into some sort of symbol we found at the clearing, with 3 dead bull elk laying in the center. We crapped bricks and never went back. I'm still working in the farm and living in the guest house, and Sam and I are closer than ever. But the thing we saw that night has left a profound effect on us.
Alright, so this happened a couple of weeks ago. I've told some of my friends, and every time I say it out loud, it just makes less and less sense to me. While it's not particularly horrifying, it was certainly something else. Tell me what you think of this. To start, my name's Alex. A good buddy of mine, Brian, invited me to go to this Christian camp. Now, I'm not very religious, but I like camping, and I like him and his family, so I said I'd go. It was a beautiful place, but way different to what I was expecting. Usually when you go to camp, you kind of keep to yourselves and set up a tent on the ground somewhere. However, here, it was like a whole community of people with trailers, tents, cabins, etc. There was daily activities and events. Everyone knew each other. It was like a family reunion where I didn't know anyone. Very different to how I normally camp, but I will say I had a great time and I felt very welcomed. I met lots of people, made a few pals, and learned a little more about Christianity, though it didn't sway my stance. Anyway, two of the people I met were named Emily and Mike. They were a few years older, but that really didn't matter. Great people who loved to party, and that was just dandy with me. I like to have some fun myself. I want to say it was like day 4 of my stay there, and it was around midnight. Everyone was going to bed, but the 4 of us stayed around the fire and had a few drinks. For those wondering, yes, drinking was definitely against the camp rules, but whatever. We were having fun. Mike then asks us if we want to go for a bit of a walk. Feeling good and not yet tired, we all said sure and off we went. Mike and I were both barefoot because why not? It's nice to feel the earth under your feet, and it didn't slow us down much, so we rolled with it for the stroll. We weren't just going to take a walk around the grounds though. We wanted to go across the road and take the trail for a little hike, so we did just that. Brian and Emily led the way with the lantern, and Mike and I followed right behind, drinks in hand. After a couple of stops to chat and take a quick rest, we continued on our journey. We were probably about 2 kilometers away from the camp when Mike and I suddenly realized Brian and Emily had marched right ahead, leaving the 2 of us behind. It didn't seem to make much sense though, because they were right in front of us the whole time. It's like they'd triple timed their walking. We didn't think anything of it. We also weren't too afraid because Mike had basically grown up in this place. He's been going here for at least 30 years or so and knows the trails very well. We had some moonlight and it was not like our eyes didn't work, so we just decided to take our time, chill out, and enjoy the beauty of the night. However, if anything did happen, my phone was dead and Mike didn't have his on him, so in hindsight, that was probably a mistake. We stopped for a few minutes so Mike could have a smoke and we chatted about some deeper topics, or at least it felt deep. Mike and I were really bonding, and it seemed like we could have kept our conversation going for hours. But out of nowhere, we hear this sort of screaming sound, probably 50 meters away. Now, we're in the woods of Canada. Lots of things make strange noises. We were trying to figure out what it could be. Mike said cougar, I said fox. It screamed again, and we still couldn't quite determine which one of the two, if either, it could be. So we hushed and waited for it to do it again. It took a couple of minutes, so naturally we got to talking again, but when it did scream, it wasn't quite the same as the first 2. Something sounded a little off about it. The distance seemed to stay the same, so our concern didn't necessarily grow, but our curiosity most certainly did. Then we really stayed quiet so we didn't miss it or mishear it with our talking. It took less than a minute this time, and it was clear as day. In a weird cougar fox-like scream, it screamed Alex. Mike and I stood still for a second and looked at each other. Mike said to me, "Did it just say your name?" I stayed quiet as I looked on into the woods. I say with certainty it wasn't a human, so I knew it wasn't Brian or Emily looking for us or anything. Plus, it was in the opposite direction of where we had to go and where they went. As I'm trying to process what I heard, I'm making an attempt at rationalizing it in my head. My thoughts are interrupted by another scream, just as clear as before. It screamed Alex. I turned to Mike and said, "Yep, that's definitely my name." "What the hell is that?" Mike had a little chuckle and said he didn't know. As I started to follow up with my worries, he shushed me and said to wait. He wanted to hear it again. I suppose I did too, but by this point, I just wanted to start heading back. I was getting increasingly uncomfortable. After the 3rd time hearing this thing scream my name, I said to Mike, "Okay, let's get out of here. I'm not sure I want to meet whatever that is." He complies, but starts talking about how he isn't worried because God is right there with him and stuff, which is fine, but it brought me little comfort. We start making our way down the trail. We took a shortcut because if we took the trail, it would have been roughly another 2 kilometers back. So we barefoot bushwhacked until we ended up on the trail again. We reached the hill where the trail began, and I heard Brian making a sort of caw sound. Mike and I returned with our own noise and began making our way down the hill. Had a laugh about how instead of calling our names, he's making a crow noise at the base of the trail. When we got to the bottom, Brian had informed us that we had been missing for about an hour and a half, and that he and Emily along with Mike's wife were getting pretty worried. Mike and I were blown away. We could have swore it was no more than a half hour or so. Maybe the time thing was just the drinks, but I swear on everything I care about that something was screaming my name. Something Mike or I couldn't identify. We went back up the following night, just to the top of the hill, but we got nothing. No screams, hardly any noise at all really, which in itself is uncomfortable for a forest. It was just an unnerving experience, and I'd be cool if it never happened again. Any input on what we may have heard that night would be appreciated.
I grew up in a small mountain town in Canada. I was about 7. It was winter. My dad and I were to meet friends at the lake to play some hockey, and we took the ATV down the trail to the lake that was about 5 kilometers away. It snowed, and there was a lot of fresh powder on the trail. My dad was driving, and I was looking around in the woods about 15 feet off the trail, when I saw this man standing there. I screamed for my dad to stop. He asked what was up, and he looked and saw him. There were no footprints or anything indicating how he had made it to the forest. We were so perplexed. My dad hurried to the lake and couldn't believe what he had seen. Me, however, I've seen the man a few times before in our local shopping center. He's always having a tea every time I saw him. He was in his mid-70s, hair slightly balding on top with a comb over to the left, and wore old faded Levi's and an 80 multicolored ski jacket, and had white sneakers. It's been 21 years since that day, and I've always wondered about the man in the woods, and so does my dad.
So this happened in 2013 when I was 18 years old. It was sometime in the summer. I've forgotten exactly when, but that isn't really relevant. My friend, her boyfriend, and several of his friends were going to camp out for a couple of nights in Sulphur, Oklahoma. They invited me and my boyfriend at the time to join them. Everything had been great. We had a typical summer camping experience with lots of swimming, hiking, and arguing over correctly setting up the tents during the day. Nighttime comes around, and earlier in the evening we befriend some people camping near us and invite them over. We have a nice fire going, and we are all just sitting around talking with our new friends and a bottle of Bacardi Zombie. Around midnight, we all start to get a little restless with our campsite. Our new friends tell us we should drive out to a cliff that overlooks the town. The moon was super bright that night, and we all thought that that was a great idea. Kids, don't go hiking in the middle of the night. It's super dangerous. Also, don't drink if you're underage. I mean, you will anyway, but as a responsible adult, I have to say that. Anyway, 9 of us pile into my friend's boyfriend's truck. 6 of us in the bed of the truck, 3 in the cab. By the way, her boyfriend didn't drink, so he was definitely okay to drive. And another point I'd like to make is that I only had 1 drink this night, and at the point of our excursion, it had been a couple of hours since I had had it, so I definitely wasn't intoxicated, and certainly not intoxicated enough to hallucinate what I saw. So where we were was a very dark rural road headed up to this cliff area. There were a few houses up this way, but at the time it was pretty desolate. There were also no cars except for us on this road at the time. My friend, my boyfriend, and myself were sitting on the driver's side of the back of the truck. So we were outside enjoying the breeze. We come up to a spot on the road where we are passing a home. Again, there are some houses out here, but not a ton, and it's not a residential area. It's rural, so no streetlights. As we pass this house, I see a girl standing next to the mailbox at the end of the driveway. She's barefoot, dirty blonde hair that's past her shoulders, light blue sundress with what appeared to be a flower print, and she's just standing there motionless and facing the road. Her face was completely expressionless. I may have thought she was a mannequin had she not turned her head and held my gaze as we drove by and kept staring until we were out of sight of each other. I instantly had chills, head to toe, and felt incredibly uneasy. She looked to be a teenager herself, or a very young adult. She was alone and the house was completely dark, no porch light or anything coming from the windows. I turned to my friend and boyfriend and asked if they had seen that, and I exclaimed how creepy that was. They agreed but didn't have too much else to say. Naturally, I thought whomever lived there was just trying to scare whoever drove by looking like a stereotypical ghost girl. But what made me so uneasy was the idea that she would have just been standing out there, alone, for who knows how long, all in the hopes that someone might drive by. Keep in mind, this was in the middle of the night, and we hadn't passed a single car the whole trip up to the cliff. It just wasn't sitting right with me. We continue on and make it to the cliff and enjoy a moonlit mini hike, and enjoyed the view over this sleepy town, without any other incidents I might add. A few years down the line, my friend and I are having spooky discussions, and I brought up that night. I asked her if she remembered that night and how creepy that was. She told me she had a confession to make. She said, "You've brought up that night a few times since then, and I have to be honest, I never actually saw anyone standing there. None of us did. We actually thought you were trying to scare us, so we played along." She went on to tell me that she does remember the house in question, and she does remember the mailbox and all of that, but that there was never a person standing next to the road beside that mailbox. And everyone else in the car? They hadn't seen her either. They all thought I was full of it, and just trying to scare everyone. What the hell did I see? I remember so many details of what she looked like, almost in a frame-by-frame sequence. I remember the uneasy feeling I got as I saw her and how it felt like she was staring directly at me. At the time, I thought she was staring at all of us, but maybe she was, in fact, only staring at me. My friend has since told me this story thoroughly creeps her out, knowing that I was dead serious about seeing her, and I definitely wasn't messing around. And I'm also way more creeped out now to know that I'm the only one who saw her. I just don't know what to think of it.
Hey guys, it's Mort here, and thank you so much for listening, and a huge thanks to my members and patrons whose names can be seen on screen. If you'd like to receive some cool perks and have your name featured at the end, follow the links in the description to find out more. But huge thank you to Deadly Cure for joining me in this video. If you enjoyed his narrations, please consider checking out his channel. A link can be found on the description and on screen now. Until next time friends, stay awesome, and I'll see you in the next one.